name is David Halbrook. Joseph knows that. I live here in Fairbanks, Alaska. Lived here for almost exactly 2 years. I'm an evangelist, which is just basically a teacher with the Chena Small Tracts Church of Christ. And Joseph and I met a little under 2 years ago, and met several times privately, and that led to this.
Yeah, my name is Joe Goulet. I actually met David while we were at, you were heading a booth at UAF, University of Alaska, where I was the head of the Secular Humanists of UAF group, and you were just boothing for the church.
Yeah.
We had a pleasant conversation. I purposely didn't let you know that I was an atheist at the time.
I just remember you were rushing to class that day.
Yes, I was, very much so. Yep. Yeah. And at the end of the conversation, I let it drop that I was the head of the Secular Humanists of UAF, just to see how it would sit.
Yeah. I don't think my face turned red that day.
No, it didn't. No. And yeah, you responded to it pretty well. So that was a pretty good indication that we might have some very pleasant conversations in the future, which I was happy about. There are some others on campus that are not quite so friendly. But yeah, I was attending college for originally a mechanical engineering degree. Found out I wasn't quite as good at math as I thought I was, and so I decided to go for history instead. But yeah, that's my short recent background.
Right.
Yeah. Been in Alaska since 2013, May, so about 8 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so the format that we have planned for this discussion, the talk is going to be regarding the assumptions of science, and you're going to go over the biblical side of the interface of science and Christianity at large. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open for 5 minutes. You're going to ask a question. You have 3 minutes to ask a question or formulate a thing, and then I have 2 minutes to respond, right?
I'll ask the pre-submitted question. You'll have 3 minutes to answer.
Okay. And then you're going to reply to what I said.
Right.
Yes. And then that's going to happen one more time with an impromptu.
And an impromptu question.
Yeah. And then roles reverse. And it's going to be the 5-3-2-3-2 system again. And then we're going to go to an open discussion, but it's going to be me directing questions or the conversation toward you, and then that will be reversed. And then we'll go with closing remarks, however, maybe X amount of minutes.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we'll get it going then, huh?
All right.
So there is an everyday common kind of parlance understanding of science that it makes no assumptions or as few assumptions as possible, basically working off the Occam's razor concept of that which takes the least amount of assumptions is the thing that's most likely to be true. But there are some assumptions that must be made within the sciences. One of them, and basically one of the more important starting assumptions, I would say, is that we are rational creatures. We have the capacity to engage in discussion with one another and be able to understand one another, and that we exist. The problem of solipsism cannot be solved within the sciences, and that we make mistakes. And being rational creatures, we have the capacity to correct mistakes that either we or others have made in the past. Another assumption that we might make is, or that we do make, is that evidence will always trump platitudes. and by platitudes I mean just like turns of phrases that sound good in and of themselves. But where evidence comes in is when we start gathering the manifestation of it within reality, that these manifestations are going to trump whatever this thing that was said is. And there are several instances. I can get into that a little later if we want. All of science, so far as I understand, works under the rubric of methodological naturalism. And that is that the scientific process cannot yet investigate the supernatural, which is markedly distinct from supernatural claims. We can investigate supernatural claims because if the claim is made in such a way that can be investigated, then that can be investigated. But the supernatural in and of itself can't be investigated. And that's largely due to the limitations of science. It is not a thing that encompasses any and all things. It's just we have the natural world to work with, and that's all we have to work with, and that's all we can investigate. And because of that, natural causes are what can be used to explain the natural phenomena that we happen to see, or not necessarily see, but experience. And again, it's not the assertion that the supernatural doesn't exist, only that we cannot investigate it. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. One of the other assumptions, and it's kind of a debate within the sciences, but anyway, uniformitarianism and catastrophism, one versus the other is kind of a debate that's going on within the sciences. But it's the common understanding right now is not necessarily that one trumps the other, or one is really a better explanation than the other. It's more that incorporating the two models into one another is going to get us closer to what happened in the past. So uniformitarianism is the idea that things in the past have acted in the past the same way that they act now. And that's kind of an ad infinitum kind of thing until you get back to the Big Bang, which there are a lot of unknowns there. Catastrophism is the idea that Earth and natural phenomena have been formed through catastrophic events that have happened in the past, and those catastrophic events work as a catalyst toward the change that the Earth or natural creatures or plants or stuff like that use as a jumping off point toward a new thing to fit to the environment, to fit themselves to the environment. And that's 5.5 minutes.
All right. So I think the question lets you say some more of what you were saying. Mm-hmm. So are there any assumptions which transcend experiment and study upon which all science is based? And if not, explain why not. Included, I believe in the question that I sent you, a quotation that I will use in my speech. Mm-hmm. So if you would say no, then explain why there are no assumptions upon which all science are based. If there are, what are the criteria for identifying acceptable assumptions?
Okay. So this is a point that I wanted to make before, is that there are assumptions in science. Anyone that tells you that there aren't doesn't know what they're talking about. And I don't mean that to be disparaging. It's just true. It The thing that must be understood, I think, is that not all assumptions are equal. There are some assumptions that can actually be demonstrated to be true. They're like some of the logical rules that we work with are incorporated into the sciences because one, they work, but two, they're demonstrated to work. It isn't necessarily that they have a foundation to work off of. It's a thing that we see that has a repeated demonstration of working and showing fruit to the concept, regardless of our ability to explain why it is the thing.
Okay.
Does that answer it fully, or
if it does to you, that's a start. So
kind of the thing, though, is I want both of us to understand as well. So if there seems to be something that's missing from that.
So the criteria for identifying assumptions that are acceptable, you would say something that we see it works. Does that let you put it in your own words?
Kind of, yes.
Or any other criteria you would add to that, since not all assumptions are equal, you said.
Yeah.
So how do you
Yes.
sort those out? Some principles.
So in the realm of logic or mathematics, we have concepts that we have discovered work. It isn't necessarily that we have invented them to work. It's just that we have seen it demonstrated that they work. Things such as the concept of 1 + 1 = 2 is not a thing we invented. It's a demonstration of things that we see work. And logic works under that kind of framework. One of the things that I've always understood logic to be is when applied to language, it is the application of mathematics to language is how I typically understand logic.
Say that again. Language is the
Application of mathematics to language.
Okay. All right. And,
So next question.
yeah. Impromptu question.
Yeah.
Same format.
Yep.
3 minutes, and then. Or wait, no. Then I would have 2 minutes. 2 minutes of response to what you've said there.
Yes. Yeah. So how would you respond to that?
So we definitely are getting some common ground here. Agreeing that science makes assumptions, and just to clarify, you would not only say science makes assumptions, but you also agree all of science is built on some assumptions. I think you said yes.
Yes.
Okay. And so that was one of the points that I had made in a lesson I did on this topic, but I need to get to a question. Okay.
Well, you're on your reply, though.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So you mentioned that science cannot investigate the supernatural, and so one important part of when we're investigating the natural, if natural explanations can't answer some area of science, then the supernatural at least has to be considered as a possibility. It can't be totally excluded. And so you even mentioned there's some things that we can't quantify or we can't observe, but we can see that they work. So those are some of the things that then at least open the door that I've got to at least be willing to consider. There may be some things affecting, influencing, if not responsible for the existence of the natural world, especially when it can be demonstrated that there is no natural explanation that can explain some area of the natural world. So I guess that would be my main point, that if science can't investigate the supernatural, at least science has to be willing to leave that open as a possibility and not slam that door. Okay, so that's our 3-2-3-2, right?
Was it? I thought that was the 3-2, not the 3-2-3-2.
You're right. That was the first two. In my head, I was going back and forth on
Sure. No.
my response and an impromptu question.
Yeah. So
now I ask an impromptu question. You have 3 minutes.
Sure.
And then I will have 2
Yep.
minutes.
Yep.
My mistake. I'm throwing us off here.
That's the first time.
So maybe I would continue on that.
It sounded like there was a very strong question in that whole thing.
Where okay, what should scientists, if scientists acknowledge, at least that you did, that science cannot encompass all things, then what should science acknowledge about the possibility of the supernatural influencing the natural?
So I don't know of many scientists that say outright that the supernatural does not exist. There are some that will say that it's faulty to assume a supernatural causation, and some will outright say that that the supernatural doesn't exist. But by and large, the last numbers I looked at least over 50%. I want to say over 50%. I don't remember the exact numbers, but are people within the scientific community are people of faith, people that believe in supernatural kind of things. So to say that they or the scientific community doesn't take into account the supernatural, I think is a little hasty. The thing that I was trying to point out was that it is just a thing that we can't investigate. It isn't off the table in terms of an explanation. It's just that it can't be investigated. And until it can be investigated, we can't really have a say on whether the thing is true or untrue. It exists in an area of I don't know.
Okay.
Want to call that, or do you want to reply to that?
You got a little more time if there's anything else you
I
want
was
to say.
going to say, if you need me to clarify anything.
No, that makes sense.
Okay. Oh, well, I suppose we can then stop it there.
Yeah.
And then you can reply.
2 more minutes.
Sure.
So there I would just say that, and we may discuss this more later, but that since science cannot encompass all things, so since there are some things that at least may be true or are true, they're outside of the realm of science, that those ought to be investigated, and whether it falls into the category of science or not, if there is truth that and it can't fit under a microscope, or it can't be seen under a microscope, but if there are things that can be proven true otherwise, that ought to, in some way and to some degree, contribute to the work of scientists, since hopefully the motivation of any scientist is just the search for truth. I want to know what truth is. So if there's something that, depending on how you define science, which was interesting when I was doing some of my study, what put us in touch on this subject, when I'd done a lesson on science, God, and you, I even read that there's not even a universally accepted definition of science. No. But so however you categorize that, if there is some truth that falls outside of someone's definition of science, then that ought to, if truth is really what we're looking for, we ought to include that in our study of what we define as science. So one example I would give is if there is prophecy in Scripture that is predictive to such a degree that falls outside of the ways that we try to forecast the weather or such things, that if the Bible records information that man doesn't have at his natural disposal, well then that ought to in some way influence our study of science.
Okay.
That's my 2 minutes.
Okay.
All right. So that was the second 3-2.
Yes.
All
yes,
right.
it was.
Thank you for keeping us on track. All right. So my 5 minutes, and then you'll ask your pre-submitted question. I'll have 3 minutes. You'll have 2 minutes.
Yep.
And then the same. All right. A University of California at Berkeley website says all of science is based on a few fundamental assumptions that transcend any individual experiment or study. Would you choose a doctor who told you the medical advice shared in this office is based on a few fundamental assumptions that transcend any individual experiment or study? If you would, you're putting your faith in him. And according to UC Berkeley, all science is based on some things like that. All science is based on things that are really not scientific. Does that mean science is useless? No. It just means that science is not always as scientific as sometimes it's represented as being. 2 examples of assumptions from that website. There are natural causes for things that happen in the world around us. And then the second, life almost certainly originated in a series of small steps, each building upon the complexity that evolved previously, or life came from non-life. So it's interesting, these beliefs transcend any individual experiment or study, according to UC Berkeley. And of course, no one has observed those things, but the belief, the faith in them is obviously very strong in many people. Some other common assumptions today are that the information in the genome exists by the process of macroevolution. The existence of Oort clouds, the multiverse, panspermia. These are not, everybody would take those, would claim those to be true, but these are just examples of assumptions made by some scientists, not attaching those to you. In addition to assumptions, all science depends upon many things that cannot be directly observed, and you've said some things like this already, so I think we agree. Life, the origin of matter, consciousness, ideas, thoughts, memory, and logic. So if we accept either assumptions or invisible realities, then we agree that we believe in some things we cannot see based upon what we can see. And that's a pretty fundamental premise that maybe we'll discuss some more. What you can see urges you and drives you to search for what you cannot see. So to go back to the examples I mentioned, you can see that natural causes cannot explain the existence of the universe. And so this should urge you to search for evidence of another cause. If a natural cause can't do it, well then a supernatural cause would be within that realm. You can see that life comes from life, so why seek for life from a non-living source? The fact that what we can see ought to drive us to seek for a living source for life. And then every day we all see that complex information and codes always require a skilled mind. So we should infer from that all genomes, genetic material, requires a skilled mind in order to exist and function. So we would naturally search for evidence of someone who is currently unseen. For a simpler example, you could research the gears of the plant hopper nymph. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating, and that is no accident, as our our bicycles also reveal. So the Bible also says in Hebrews 11:3 that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. We're seriously considering that there's another part of the universe that we can't be in contact with, that we can't measure, that obeys different laws, including the fundamental laws of physics. And that's quite sad when you think about it, because it means we may end up with an explanation like things are like they are because they're like that. That was said by the research director of the Paris Institute of Astrophysics, Francois Boucher. So he's partly right. There is another place that we can't measure that is not subject to the laws of physics, but his explanation is wrong. Things are like they are because God lives, and that's based on evidence, not assumption. True science and true religion only appear incompatible when feelings, flawed assumptions, honest mistakes, lies, or man-made religion interfere. I'm interested in truth and every method of identifying truth. And at least to some degree in that principle, that's why you and I have had these conversations. And to anyone who's listening, I'm interested in talking and listening to you in that same pursuit.
Mm-hmm. Cool. That was about equal.
Okay, good.
I wasn't paying attention until right up the end. I was like, oh, wow, that was convenient.
What are the odds?
Okay, so yeah, my question to you, and then you got 3 minutes.
Yeah.
How do we understand or determine when science and truth have merged? I suppose you can clarify what you think I mean.
Yeah.
Or you can ask me what you think I mean.
Okay. So my short answer would be when it does not contradict any other truth, and especially more fundamental truths. That would be the short answer. And so this is the flaw, I believe, of all science, is based on assumptions. In that case, the front of the train that's pulling all science are assumptions. There are scientists, as you mentioned a little bit ago, who they do their science not based on those assumptions, but upon things they would say are actually fundamental truths and that are not assumptions. And that makes more sense. Then you've got an engine pulling their beliefs. So, for example, here, obviously, our discussion is not, is science useful? Mm-hmm. So, science has gotten many things right because they've identified principles that are consistent across life forms, across systems, across time. And so that provides multiple avenues of examination. And I think one of the best examples of that is the coding system, the sequence within the genome. But what some scientists have gotten wrong is that life and systems and the code, the language form of the genome, can exist and can thrive as the result of chance. So again, on the question, so how do I determine that in that area that science has not merged with truth? On an elementary basis, that contradicts the common observation and the common experience of all humanity. And it also defies the logic by which all humanity does their daily functions on a daily basis. Now, admittedly, those two can be mistaken, but it requires evidence to override that and to persuade people that the laws by which they live and work and reason are not don't reflect reality. But also, if science contradicts the only written record of the history of the physical universe, which has the evidence to sustain what it claims, the Bible, then if it's contradicting more fundamental truths, then that relates to the original question. So to successfully identify when science and truth merge, our most basic beliefs have to be true, or else then we'll believe other things that are not true, and then we'll believe more things that are not true. And so God must be included in science if the search for all available truth is the motive for doing science, and the evidence justifies that. If God is avoided or excluded in the search for truth, then the best that science can offer is helpful truths that are based on assumptions. So you have 2 minutes, whatever direction you want to go.
So many questions. Where to go with it? Okay. What is the difference between a fundamental truth and an assumption?
Fundamental just being basic, so the most basic reality.
Sure. How is that different from an assumption? How do we know that that is a fundamental truth, and how do we create a distinction between that and an assumption?
The evidence will the evidence will demonstrate something to be true and not an assumption.
Right, but you have to get to the evidence somehow.
Right? So when you have whatever the totality of evidence available for whatever the subject is, the evidence will sustain whether it's true or whether it's an assumption. Because if there's sufficient evidence, there's no reason to call it an assumption, then it's true. Oh, didn't start your time, but...
Oh, this is turning into more of a discussion. I think I'm kind of failing to see the connective tissue here. Because it isn't as though the assumptions that science is working with aren't evidenced. So in that vein, that would also be a fundamental truth. Like laws of logic and whatnot would be fundamental truths, which science works with. So I'm kind of failing to see where we're going here.
I would just say that the laws of logic are not based on, I would say they're not based on assumptions. I would say there's foundational truths that sustain those, not assumptions.
I think we might save that for the discussion, because I could go for a long time on that. All right. So yeah, I suppose we'll stop the timer now.
Okay.
We'll take.
You've got an impromptu question.
That was the impromptu question.
I thought that was your 2-minute response.
Oh.
You did the same thing I did. I feel a little better now.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I am not infallible.
We share that at this table. And that's recorded and demonstrated.
Right. Oh, God, that's on forever. Okay.
So now you can ask an impromptu question, and I'll have 3 minutes.
Okay, I guess my reply was a back and forth.
I started to say that, but I thought, well, it's his time. I didn't want to waste your time telling you how to use your time.
Okay. Wow. All right. Well, I did say I have several questions. Okay. So within your response or your presentation, sorry.
Yeah.
I noticed you used the term truth several times, and I want to know if are you using a consistent definition, or is the definition shifting from instance to instance? Because it seemed like in the very first time you used it, I was like, okay, that's the context where he means that. And then the second one, I was like, I don't know that matches the context, or at least the message of what you're trying to say. And I could have just misheard it completely. And so that's my question.
So your question is, how am I using truth?
Yeah, within your presentation, are there different definitions for the word truth? Like in the first one, I noticed it could be capital T truth, whereas the second one is like lowercase t truth.
Can you clarify, is capital T truth objective truth and small t is subjective truth, or what do you mean?
The end all be all. Like an absolute truth versus an objective truth, because there is a bit of a distinction to make there.
Okay, we might have to discuss that. I don't know that I've thought of that before. So, just before I start my time, be sure I'm understanding your question. Am I using truth to mean different things?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, does the definition shift?
Okay. Does the definition of truth shift? No. Truth is, the standard definition would be, as I would use it, is objective reality. And so then our ability to understand objective reality, there may be some degrees in how well I understand it, but how well I understand it doesn't affect the nature of its reality. So no, I'm not intending to use truth in any way that is different. My best guess is that you may be perceiving, or maybe I'm using it in a way that what is incomplete is maybe our understanding of it, but truth is, or at least fundamental truths are absolute, and so they don't change based on whether I'll just start with God is. So whether I know it or not, just out of total ignorance, that doesn't affect whether God does or does not exist. Whether I believe it or not, to the degree to which I understand who God is, that's an absolute matter. And so the definition of truth does not shift. The only thing that may differ is our understanding of truth. So I was trying to find an example of where I used truth, just not coming to me.
Sure, yeah.
But at the end, I said I'm interested in truth and every method of identifying truth. So, meaning that, I definitely mean the truth in its absolute sense, and the ability to understand truth is based on our abilities. One of the things that you mentioned as an assumption that we're rational creatures, and by a typical evolutionary approach to the existence of man, that's also an assumption that hard to find a lot of firm grounding for. But if we are the result of the creation of God and man being made in His image, that fits and flows together, that we are rational beings. And so God being the fundamental truth, and then that we are rational beings being also an absolute truth, but it's based on a more fundamental truth. So that's my 3 minutes. You then have 2 minutes to reply. Mm-hmm. If you want to ask me something, but this is your 2-minute response.
Just turn it into a discussion.
That's what I've
again.
done too. Yeah, and that'll help us. That was a good suggestion.
Sure.
I think that'll help later, but I won't comment.
It probably will. So I think I'm really just confused about. So there can be. I suppose I'll just respond to the question that I asked.
Yeah.
Is there can be differing definitions for different words or terms that can flow from one even from one word to another. Like if we use the term "yeah, right," we can mean it as to be like a negative connotation, or we can mean it very positively.
Yeah.
And so for a shifting definition, even within a sentence, to have different connotations is completely fine. It doesn't mean that you're negating a point that you had made one way or another. It just means that we have to make clear the definitions within the sentences that we make.
Yeah.
That we understand one another, and that was the only thing that I had meant by the question at all. And perhaps we may have to, or I may have to rewatch it and make sure that I actually understood what the heck was going on.
That's the nature of this, and that happened at the coffee shop too.
Indeed. All right.
Your 10 minutes.
10 minutes starts now. Okay, so there's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of things we could go on right now. One thing that you seem to hit on that seemed to be at least part of something you stand in a pretty strong opposition to is the concept of life from non-life.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly don't know why I'm starting with this one because it's kind of irrelevant to the whole thing, but I am curious. You're saying that we don't understand, and correct me obviously
Sure.
if I'm wrong.
That's understood in all of this likewise.
Yes. That since we haven't been able to see life come from non-life, that we can't assume that that is possible, or that it is improbable.
I would start with, since the combination of two things. One, since the common experience of all humanity is we observe and test the scientific method definitely shows life comes from life. We know that for sure. Then in the absence of life coming from non-life, then there is far more evidence that ought to focus our investigation of the subject on life coming from life as opposed to life coming from non-life. The gap between the two is huge, and so that's part of that equation.
So this, I think, may be a part where even the scientific community is kind of discussing. They're discussing for a while. How do we define life? And it's currently, and it's been a debate for a long time, whether a virus is considered or can be considered life, because it has no capacity to replicate on its own. It has to have some other thing that it can parasitize in order to replicate. And that seems to be right on the edge of life. On the other hand, human sex cells, like the sperm and the egg, right, cannot replicate unless they have one another. So can we consider either one of those things to be alive?
I don't know. You could provide some individual examples like the virus or the egg or the sperm, but whether those fit the definition of life. And the little bit I've read on that, like you, is kind of like science. There's not a universally accepted definition of it. So while there may be some areas where we're working through, does this fall into the category of life? We do know life when we see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we just stay within what we know, and this is just an axiom, we use what we know to help us understand what we don't know. And so if we stay within what we know about life, when we take things that we know fit the definition of life, if we just stay within what we know, then there is no evidence or law of logic that would lead to the conclusion that life comes from non-life. all of the evidence and all of the laws of logic lead to the conclusion life always comes from life.
I'm not sure that answered the question.
I thought you asked, is a sperm or an egg potentially? So what I was saying is, I don't know.
Okay.
But
okay. Yeah. So this can actually provide us a way to falsify a thing.
Okay.
Which is a scientific assumption. The concept of falsification. If you cannot falsify a thing, then it cannot be science. So if a sperm and an egg cannot be life, or is not life, not cannot, but if a sperm and an egg individually are not life, can it not be said then that we see life come from non-life every day? This is working off the if assumption. The if is doing the lifting here.
If there's something we definitively know is not life, and then from that comes life, well then okay, then we have non-life from life.
Okay. How would that change your idea of the supernatural or God?
If a sperm is not life?
Just the idea that we see non-life come from life every day.
I mean, we don't see it, so you're just saying hypothetically if we did see it.
Sure, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Then I would say the more likely conclusion is what we think to be non-life coming from life.
I'm saying definitively, we can definitively say that it is non-life coming from life, or life coming from non-life, sorry.
Yeah.
How would that change your concept of the supernatural or God, if at all? It doesn't have to change in any capacity.
Yeah. It's so far because of the fundamental truths that I mentioned earlier. Something that violates a more fundamental truth.
I don't know that we know it's a fundamental truth, though, is the thing.
Well, I mean, you do have to work through, okay, what is that list? But,
sure.
But as a principle, I think we would agree there's some truths more fundamental than others.
I still think that a fundamental truth is still an assumption.
And I don't know if there's another word. I mean, because I'm thinking we probably agree with the principle, but I just may not be finding the words to communicate that.
Perhaps not. We may be talking past one another.
So in response to the question, it would be, what if there was a round square? Then how would that affect? Well, that would just mean the definition of something has changed, but I don't know what seeing a round square how that would affect my beliefs about geometry. Because I think the idea of there being a round square are further upstream from the fundamental laws of geometry. So I don't really know how to answer that question. If we believed we saw life from non-life, then I believe we were mistaken in what we think we see.
So you would go so far as to say that even if we could definitively prove, like with no shadow of a doubt whatsoever, that and hundreds of thousands of replicated studies across the world, that you would say that all of those people are wrong? Millions even. I mean, we are literally talking about millions and billions of instances of this happening.
it's just so hypothetical. It would mean it would mean some idea is wrong, but it's. I guess I just have to see it to know. I don't know how to anticipate.
I suppose the deeper question here is, if it does or does not change your conception of the supernatural God, why or why not does it? Like, because so far as I'm understanding, even if you were to see it, and you're kind of waffling a little bit, understandably, obviously, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure you would actually change your idea that a God exists. Even if we were to see a life come from a non-life, that could easily be just this is another miracle that God has created.
Yeah, I mean that would be a possibility. I would have to I would re-examine a lot of things. If I walked outside, if we walked outside, and every little pebble Pebble started springing legs and walking up and started talking to me, I would start re-examining my most fundamental beliefs.
Sure.
If
science,
the reality shifted,
the sciences don't
degree.
go that far. I mean, not even remotely that far.
But I'm just saying that would be life from non-life.
Sure.
So if I would, there would just be three areas I'd have to investigate. My own mind, if I saw life coming from non-life or what I thought it was, and then I would re-examine whatever that event was, and then I would re-examine, okay, what have I believed about God? Is there something I've misunderstood there that would allow those two to be consistent with each other?
Well, 10 minutes is long enough.
Wow.
Yes.
Sorry that a lot of that was me pausing and thinking.
Oh, but, no, this is the way our conversations go.
So this probably not directly connected with that, but maybe there'd be some overlap. So I want to go to one of the other points that I brought up on like the origin of the genome, and it's paralleling that with that plant hopper nymph, the gears. So the origin of those two things cannot be explained by naturalism. The genome, for example, the nature of that code is such that it's often described as a language, and then I like that the gears of the plant hopper because it's a similar example, but it's just something easier for someone like me to grasp because I understand the nature of gears better than I do the nature of a genome.
From what I understand, it's kind of working off the idea of irreducible complexity.
Okay.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes, to some degree.
Okay, yeah.
So, going back to what role, where's science and what should the relationship be in considering the supernatural. So, in areas such as those, the search for answers and the evidence for the origin of those things and things like it, that has to, whether or not someone says science can investigate that or not, even setting that aside, if there is evidence available for that, that has to at least be considered by science.
I don't know that no one does consider it a possibility.
Okay.
It's kind of just goes back to what I was saying before. It's just that we have no way to investigate that claim. I don't think we can actually investigate that particular claim. It's not that it's off the table. It's just that we don't have the means to investigate it.
And I would say one of the means of that and we've talked about this briefly, whether or not this is later useful to continue. But I believe prophecy, the prophecy of the Old Testament, and then those that are in history that have been fulfilled, they provide that, because that becomes the best evidence. Because I agree, we cannot investigate in our generation the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
That's based upon whether there are eyewitnesses and whether their testimony is trustworthy or not.
A lot of gifts.
So, so what can we investigate? And prophecy becomes something of that sort, that because it's undeniable that those things were written. In the case of Jesus, I don't know of anyone that would deny the Old Testament was written before Jesus lived.
I'd like to meet that person.
The one who would deny that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I really want to talk to you.
So, because that's acknowledged as being true, that the Old Testament documents existed before Jesus did, then that becomes an area that, if there is knowledge that we know existed in the minds of men, and that the knowledge they had is impossible for man to come by through natural means, then if we have sufficient evidence that has happened, that now becomes something that we can investigate. And then if that source proves itself to be true, now we have something like what I'm saying, that science has to at least consider that information and that evidence, because its implications spill over into the scientific realm. And I appreciate the things you said, that, well, those things are not just automatically excluded, they're on the table. You just have to lay out what is the evidence for that.
Yeah, you have to be able to investigate it.
Right. And prophecy can be investigated.
So this is kind of one of those things that we've talked about before on separate occasions. And I'm much more of the mind that, sure, we can look at the prophecy and see that it's consistent within this document, but it just means that the document's consistent. It doesn't necessarily mean that the prophecy is true necessarily. And I'm more than confident that there are a lot of prophecies that never came true.
Prophecies in the Bible.
Yes.
Okay.
And so if that is the case, then how do we reconcile that to the model that is being proposed? Does it not falsify it in some capacity? And if it does falsify it, then how do we determine what within this document is now true or false? How do we determine allegory from just a distinct claim?
That context is the answer to that. Just like, that's the way we would do that with any document. And so I believe the Bible has both, evidence of a supernatural origin, but it's human language, so it plays by the rules of human language in that sense. And so whether something is allegorical or not, it's hard to speak about in generalities. You'd really just have to pick out an example and say, well, what's the evidence that someone's using figurative or literal language, allegorical, the same way we would have to do that. I didn't understand what Joe said. Did he really mean that? That's all right.
Sure.
So the context would indicate that.
Sure. But I think even within taking context into account, there are still instances of that happening within the Bible.
Instances of prophecies not coming true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of those, but...
Sure. We were going somewhere with this whole thing.
Yeah, I was just saying prophecy becomes an area of investigation.
Sure.
That then...
Oh, okay, yeah.
Then would bleed over. The consequences of prophecy would be such
that
then science would have to, whether even I don't think it's really relevant whether or not you want to quantify or define that as science or not. Once evidence the consequences of that evidence bleed over into the scientific realm and ought to be considered.
Sure. So if there, let's just work with the prophecy thing right now,
Okay.
And we'll give that prophecies within the Bible come true. They're all true. I'll grant that much. In terms of events happening, I should say,
Yeah.
as an amendment. We could, I think, at best say that these events happened and these people talked about them. But I don't know that we can say that it was necessarily a prediction of the future. And I think at this point we might want to define what the word prophecy means.
Yeah.
Because any prediction, if prophecy becomes any prediction, then I could order a steak, and then when someone brings
Right.
me a steak, then it's, hey, I made a prophecy.
Right. So give your definition of prophecy, and I'll give mine and see if they overlap. But
I don't know that I can give a definition, honestly.
Okay.
In all of the instances that I've seen, and from reading the Bible and being familiar with many religions around the world, prophecy can mean a strong multitude of things. Even within the Bible, it can mean a lot of different things. It can be like extremely vague to kind of spelled out.
yeah, I mean, it can just mean teaching, and then it can be something more specific of knowledge that is given of the future,
Yeah.
and it's of a kind. It's so specific. It's something that man could not possibly know by natural learning. So that's
Sure, and in events like that, I think even then it would be just as possible to know the prophecy and then act it out. I don't think that would be a difficult thing, especially if it's a prophecy that's known for thousands of years. People know this thing is going to happen at some point, and there's no real timeline given to the thing. You act it out at any time, and there it is. Someone fulfilled the prophecy.
But if there's multiple prophecies related to the same subject, the more you have, the more difficult it becomes to replicate that of your own initiative. And
Sure.
I'll give you the last statement because it's 10.
Oh,
That's 10 minutes.
Oh, is it? That always goes so fast. Yes, it would become more difficult over time. But over time, you would have that many more instances of being able to pull it off, essentially. So,
Okay.
all right.
All right. Closing remarks.
Thanks for inviting me. This was fun. Yeah, I can't really think of very much in the way of closing remarks other than I think I'm going to be really curious to look over this conversation just because especially in the moment I found it super fascinating. And again, this is a thing that I really like talking about with you about, is because we engage with each other really well.
Yeah.
And we disagree on a whole heck of a lot of things. Yeah, and I think as long as we keep doing that, we're probably going to be able to at least change a couple people's lives for the better.
I have that confidence in truth, that truth has nothing to hide, and that truth only becomes better understood the more that it's investigated. And so there's no reason for our conversations never have, but I know we
Right.
talked about this, that society, some parts of society become so divisive against each other that people can't just sit down and disagree and explain, and to be able to verbalize and put into words what they believe without misrepresenting what someone else believes. And so that has helped make our conversations possible.
Absolutely.
If I can just take a second, I would have a few words to those who might be watching,
Sure.
and you can feel free to do the same. The subject of truth, again, I think that's what has allowed Joe and I to have these conversations. And so I'm certainly not against science, but I propose truth be identified on the fundamental idea that we can understand our world, and you said some things like this, to at least some degree, when we consider all of the relevant and available evidence. And so that's the approach that I take, that leads to the conclusion and the confidence that God has spoken, and that Jesus is God, and that he lived on this earth in flesh and died and arose from the dead, and other things like that, the forgiveness of guilt and of sin, confidence that there will be justice, the reality of eternity, and even the relief that comes from hope, that those are things to be believed on the basis of evidence and not upon assumptions. And so that's where I would close and tie all of this together, that true science contributes to the conclusion that God is, and that's why I believe it's worth calling attention to. If all science is based on assumption, it lacks something, whereas when God is included, you get many of the same helpful conclusions, but things are not left to assumption.
Yeah, I would just say if you're curious, of a curious mind, anyways, to just look into how the scientific process works, look into the philosophy of science, some ideas from the past that didn't pan out, and why we work with the models that we do currently, and actually look at the assumptions and the reasoning behind why they're there. I'm just a guy that happens to like science. I am not a professional in any capacity. And I'm a guy that enjoys just talking about things to other people.
Yeah.
So, and science happens to be one of my passions, investigating not necessarily what things are, but how the entire process works. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Well, if anybody that's listening to this, part of what we've talked about is if there's interest in this, then we would consider doing it again, just depending on the nature of that. If it's worth recording and putting out there for others, that's fine. If not,
Sure.
we can continue this on our own. But if you are watching or listening and you're interested, we're not trying to monetize anything. Just let us know if it's worth your time, and that would contribute to us deciding whether or not it's worth more of our time.
If people enjoyed the discussion here, or enjoyed the example of how people can disagree and still talk in a civil manner, then yeah, let us know. I would be very curious to keep, or very happy to see these conversations continue, and maybe even expand a little bit.
And more important than watching this is go out and do it yourself.
Indeed.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.